We're going to bring in the panel. Former Republican National Chairman Michael Steele, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker, and Wall Street Journal White House reporter Sabrina Siddiqui. So, Michael, what metric is Haley measuring herself to, do you think, to stay in the race? What margin of donors, for instance, need to see Saturday? What do they need to see Saturday to stick with her? And this pressure from the RNC, as Donald Trump is, of course, trying to take over the RNC with all of its fundraising ability.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump's already taken over the RNC. That's a given. He had it under the current chairman, Ronna McDaniels, made sure that the dollars flowed to Trump and his legal efforts back in the day. That will not change going forward. I think for Haley on Saturday, and the lead up with this speech now is to try to tell us something that all of us believe is not going to happen, and that is that there is no path forward beyond South Carolina. When you cannot win your home state and you lose it, if the numbers hold up the way they are showing right now, some 28 to 30 points down, what is the justification for any donor to write a check going into Super Tuesday? The reality of Super Tuesday is there are not a lot of Democrats and independents voting in Republican primaries going forward. A lot of these states on Super Tuesday are winner-take-all states. The 15th of March is when the winner-take-all locks in completely for all the remaining primaries. So the reality is this is the moment. And I think that what she's trying to do is trying to stretch the moment to avoid, that leads to her getting out of the race. And here's why it's so important. I think the fact that no one has come to her aid in the time that Tim Scott and Ron DeSantis has dropped out, meaning national Republicans forming a line behind her to reinforce her bid against Donald Trump, tells you everything you need to know. This is not just about voters and primary voters on a primary election day. It is also about where the party leadership is, and they're not with Nikki Haley, unfortunately.
And Peter Baker, as Nikki Haley is speaking, she is saying that she's not going anywhere. She's staying in the race. So it's, as Haley was reporting, as we were predicting, that this speech is basically to reset the table and hope that the money keeps flowing in. But meanwhile, what she's doing also is, the other day, she said that Donald Trump goes weak in the knees when it comes to Russia. She accused him of siding with a dictator who kills his political opponents. That's her quote. Trump has not condemned Navalny's death. And he even compared Navalny, the martyred hero who went back into the fight against Vladimir Putin, comparing Navalny with himself as, I guess, Donald Trump portraying himself as the victim of political and legal persecution. You literally wrote the book on Trump. How does he justify his position on NATO, on Putin, and comparing himself to someone as courageous, a fighter for democracy, as Alexei Navalny, Peter?
Well, look, we have seen time and time again that former President Trump, gets away with saying things that would have sunk any other candidate, particularly in a Republican primary. The idea that you would go soft on Vladimir Putin, that you would say the NATO allies should be attacked by Russia, the idea that you would compare yourself to a martyr dissident who died in an Arctic prison. None of that would have sold in the past, but he manages, as he always has, to somehow make the outrageous sound exciting to his base. They seem to love every provocative, wild thing that he says and lap it up for more. And he says it because it gets him attention. He enjoys the attention. The attention works for him. Now, very soon, we're going to get outside of this Republican primary bubble, though, and see whether it works in a general election contest. And that we don't really know. There are, of course, polls showing he's doing just as well, if not a little better, than Joe Biden in a general election matchup. But we really haven't engaged yet in the real way on that choice. So the things that work in a Republican primary may be hindrances in a general election. We'll see. It's hard to say. We shouldn't make predictions. But you're right. He likes the attention no matter how unorthodox and unusual and ahistoric his comments may be.
And what Nikki Haley has just said is that she sees no need to kiss the ring. I have no fear of Trump's retribution. Not kissing the ring like so many who have gone down to Mar-a-Lago, most recently the Speaker of the House. Sabrina, She's taking out a position against Donald Trump, which you could argue, if it goes his way, he's not only the nominee, but if he ends up winning, rather, if he ends up losing again, as she is predicting, she could be the I told you so person in the Republican Party, saying, I warned you of that, and hoping to preserve, her position and her moral authority for a future race.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Nikki Haley. This election, this campaign does not seem to be the moment where that message is resonating. And a lot of her strategy does really depend on pulling support from the more moderate Republicans or independents who are not ultimately those that decide a primary contest, right? Those are really the diehard Republicans who are showing up to the polls. And New Hampshire was actually the test of those moderate and independent-minded voters, and there weren't enough to get her a victory there. She still lost by double digits. So now they're kind of saying they're going to stake in it through Super Tuesday. Maybe there are, again, some states where she could perform better, but what the campaign can't point to is a state that they think they can win. And again, at this current rate, former President Trump looks poised to hit that 50% threshold to become the presumptive nominee in March. So time is just not on Governor Haley's side.
And Peter
Former
Baker,
Governor Haley's side.
I was just going to say to Peter, because both of us were in Munich at the security conference, the rest of the world is looking at us with dismay, with fear, and with concern about the future of NATO, about the future of Ukraine. And they just do not understand what has happened to the Republican Party. And a lot of the people that we were talking to, the Republican and House members there as well, they weren't the Trump supporters. They weren't really, except with two exceptions, the MAGA people. So, you had, a couple of people on the Senate side, and on the House side, I guess, who were more Trump MAGA people. But most of the people in Munich were the people who were internationalists and are mortified by what's going on.
Yeah, we talked to a top German official while we were there, and he used the word panic to describe the feeling in the room about what's happening in the United States. Every American official I talked to there said every person they ran into was asking them, what on earth is happening? What's going on with you guys? What's going to happen in the fall? No question, I think that they are very nervous about the course of events in Washington, both the House Republicans blocking the aid to Ukraine, which would give, in their view, Vladimir Putin a win, and, of course, the potential of Donald Trump coming back. And the minute he is elected, that's the end of the Article 5 mutual defense assurance of the NATO treaty. Even if the United States stays in NATO, nobody would trust that Donald Trump would abide by the Article 5 commitment to come to anybody's aid. And I think that they have woken up. The last time I was in Germany a few months ago, there was a lot of disbelief and skepticism. Oh, well, Trump can't really come back, right? This is just sort of everybody getting all worked up. Now, in this last weekend when you and I were there, the tone had changed dramatically. They are really very, very deeply concerned about what's happening in the United States and whether America would continue to lead on the world stage.